There is a quiet mystery that surrounds those who are called empaths. They carry within them a kind of light that cannot be easily defined. It is not simply kindness or sensitivity but something deeper, something closer to a living flame that burns inside the soul. This flame illuminates rooms without a word, softens the sharp edges of conflict, and reminds even the most weary spirit that gentleness has not disappeared from the world. Yet this same light that warms many hearts can also stir an unspoken hostility in others. It can call forth resentment, jealousy, and even subtle forms of sabotage. And here we begin to step into the psychological depths that Carl Jung spent his life exploring. Jung observed that within each human being lies not only the conscious self that we carefully show to the world but also the vast landscape of the unconscious. In this hidden terrain live the impulses we deny, the fears we suppress, and the shadows we would rather not admit. For many, encountering a person who radiates authentic empathy is like standing before a mirror that exposes these shadows. The empath's light does not judge, and yet its mere presence forces others to confront what they have buried. This confrontation is rarely comfortable. It awakens envy in those who cannot access the same depth of feeling, and it unsettles those who fear their own vulnerability. To understand why empaths often attract people who secretly resent them, we must look at the paradox of human relationships. On the surface, light is attractive. We are drawn to warmth, to compassion, to authenticity, because in them we sense the possibility of healing. But on a deeper level, the same light threatens the fragile structures that many people have built to protect themselves. Imagine a man who has lived his entire life behind the armor of pride. He meets an empath who sees through that armor with gentle eyes. Outwardly he may praise the empath's kindness, but inwardly he begins to resent the exposure. The very light that could soften him becomes the light he wants to extinguish. Jung believed that resentment is often the disguised face of projection. What we dislike in another person is often something we cannot bear to recognize in ourselves. The empath's presence awakens dormant aspects of the unconscious in others. Those who secretly crave compassion but have denied it to themselves may feel an ache that hardens into anger. Those who long for authenticity but have built their lives on masks may feel shame that quickly becomes bitterness. The empath becomes a screen onto which these unresolved conflicts are projected. It is not that the empath has done harm. It is that the light of their being casts shadows too sharp for others to ignore. The tragedy is that empaths often take this resentment personally. Their hearts are tuned to the emotions of others, and so they feel the sting of unspoken hostility, as if it were a wound inflicted upon their own spirit. Yet in truth the resentment belongs not to them but to the hidden struggles of those around them. This is where Jung's insight into individuation becomes so important. Individuation is the lifelong process of becoming whole, of reconciling light and shadow within oneself. When a person refuses this inner journey, the presence of an empath can feel unbearable. Instead of walking toward their own healing, they turn against the one who unknowingly reminds them of what they have avoided. The pattern becomes clearer when we look at the kinds of people empaths often attract. They are not always malicious or cruel. Many are simply fragmented souls carrying unhealed wounds. They are drawn to the warmth of the empath because it offers relief. But they are also unsettled by it because it demands honesty. And honesty can be terrifying for those who have built their lives on denial. The empath's light shines into corners that others would rather keep in darkness. And so admiration turns into envy, closeness turns into resistance, and love can even twist into resentment. What makes this dynamic so painful is that empaths do not set out to expose anyone. Their gift is not a weapon but a natural radiance. Yet the effect is the same. In Jung's language, the empath becomes an archetype of the self, the wholeness that everyone unconsciously seeks. And standing before this archetype awakens both longing and fear. The longing to be whole again, and the fear of what must be faced to reach that wholeness. Thus the empath is loved and resented in equal measure, embraced for their light and blamed for the shadows that light reveals. This paradox is not a curse but a profound lesson. It teaches that carrying light will always come with a cost. It is not only a source of beauty but also a source of conflict. And in this tension lies the very essence of what Jung called the individuation journey. To walk as an empath is to walk as both a healer and a mirror. It is to know that some will draw strength from your presence while others will secretly wish to dim it. And yet the light must be carried because it is not for the ego, but for the greater unfolding of the human soul. If we travel deeper into Jung's understanding, we find that the resentment directed toward empaths is not random. It follows a symbolic rhythm, almost like an ancient myth being replayed in daily life. Light and shadow are forever entwined, and whenever light grows brighter, the shadow stretches longer. The empath's gift of sensitivity intensifies this rhythm. Their presence heightens the emotional landscape of others. They act as a living reminder that the unconscious cannot be ignored forever. And for those unwilling to face their own inner contradictions, this reminder feels like an intrusion. Consider the quiet terror that many people carry. They fear their own fragility, yet they also fear their own power. They fear intimacy, but they also fear isolation. Jung showed that much of human suffering arises from this split between what is lived outwardly and what is repressed inwardly. When an empath enters their life, this fragile balance is disturbed. The empath does not demand confession, but their openness awakens truths that lie just beneath the surface. Suddenly the mask begins to crack. Suddenly the illusion of control begins to weaken. What follows is often not gratitude but hostility, because the ego will protect its defenses with all its strength. This is why empaths can feel like both a blessing and a threat. They embody what Jung described as the anima and animus energies, the inner feminine and masculine that seek reconciliation. When someone is disconnected from these inner figures, encountering an empath feels like encountering a part of themselves they have neglected. For example, a man who has rejected his own tenderness may be deeply unsettled by the empathy of another. He might admire it on one level but secretly resent it on another, because it exposes his own disconnection from that tenderness. The empath is not merely a person in his life. They are an awakening of the psyche itself. This dynamic can also be traced through Jung's idea of the shadow. The shadow is not only the darkness we fear but also the unlived potential we have rejected. Empaths often call forth both. Their sensitivity exposes the coldness in others, but it also highlights the depth that others have denied themselves. To stand before an empath is to stand before possibility, but possibility comes with a price. It asks for surrender, for change, for honesty. And not everyone is willing to pay that price. Instead, they project resentment outward rather than turn inward toward growth. The pain of this projection can be immense. Empaths often sense hostility long before it is spoken. A shift in tone, a fleeting look, an unspoken tension can weigh heavily on them. Jung wrote of how the unconscious communicates through subtle signals, and empaths, attuned as they are, become receivers of these signals. They pick up what others cannot admit even to themselves. This awareness can feel like a burden because it means living with truths that others refuse to acknowledge. And in relationships, it can mean carrying the weight of resentment that was never truly theirs to bear. Yet within this difficulty lies a profound calling. Empaths stand as witnesses to the parts of humanity that most would rather ignore. They are not only healers of wounds but also mirrors of truth. Jung often described the role of the healer as one who descends into the depths and returns with light. Empaths embody this archetype whether they wish to or not. Their sensitivity is their descent. Their compassion is their light. But the descent cannot be made without stirring the shadows of those around them. And so resentment follows, not as punishment, but as the natural resistance of the psyche when it is forced toward transformation. To understand this is to begin to free oneself from despair. The empath need not see resentment as rejection of who they are. Rather, it is a sign of the power of their presence. It means that their light is doing what light has always done. It reveals. It disrupts. It calls forth. And though some may respond with hostility, others will respond with awakening. Jung taught that wholeness comes not through avoiding conflict but through moving through it with awareness. In this sense, the empath's journey is inseparable from the collective journey of humanity itself. For as long as there is light, there will be shadow. And as long as there is shadow, there will be the work of healing. There is another layer to this story, one that Jung often hinted at in his writings on archetypes and collective patterns. The resentment directed at empaths is not only personal. It is also cultural. In societies that prize dominance, speed, and outward success, qualities like gentleness and sensitivity are often dismissed as weakness. This cultural attitude seeps into the individual's psyche, shaping how people view themselves and others. When an empath steps into such a world, their very existence challenges these assumptions. Their quiet strength contradicts the myth that only hardness survives. Their compassion contradicts the myth that only self-interest matters. And so the culture itself reacts through individuals, producing resentment in the face of what it cannot yet value. This cultural shadow is vast. It appears in workplaces that reward aggression over cooperation. It appears in relationships that glorify control over vulnerability. It appears in families where children are taught to hide their feelings rather than express them. Against this backdrop, the empath becomes a kind of rebel without intending to be. Simply by being authentic, they disrupt the story that power belongs only to those who dominate. Their light exposes the poverty of such illusions. And once again, the result is a mixture of admiration and hostility. People sense the truth in the empath's way of being, but they also feel threatened by what it reveals about their own compromises. Jung would have described this as a clash between the persona and the self. The persona is the mask we wear to adapt to society, while the self represents the totality of who we truly are. Many live primarily through the persona, shaping themselves into what the world demands. When an empath enters their life, the contrast between persona and self becomes unbearable. The empath does not live only from a mask. They allow the deeper self to shine through. For someone identified only with their persona, this can feel like an attack, as if their entire identity were being questioned. The resentment they direct toward the empath is, in truth, resentment toward the parts of themselves they have lost. It is here that the pattern of attraction becomes more striking. Empaths often find themselves surrounded by those who most resist their influence. Jung's concept of synchronicity may offer an explanation. Life brings together the exact encounters that the soul requires for growth. For empaths, this often means encountering people who mirror back the cost of carrying light. They are drawn into relationships that test the strength of their compassion, that reveal the fine line between love and self-sacrifice. These encounters are not punishments. They are part of the deeper rhythm of individuation. By facing resentment without losing themselves, empaths refine their gift and learn the boundaries that keep it alive. Boundaries are essential, and Jung hinted at this when he spoke of the danger of inflation. When a person identifies too strongly with an archetype, they risk being consumed by it. For the empath, the danger is identifying so completely with the healer role that they forget their own humanity. They give endlessly, absorb endlessly, until they are drained. And in this exhaustion, resentment can finally break them. To prevent this, boundaries must be seen not as rejection but as self-respect. The light cannot shine if the flame is extinguished. To carry empathy in a hostile world is to walk a narrow path where giving and protecting must exist together. The paradox is that resentment, though painful, often deepens the empath's journey. It forces them to ask hard questions about where their responsibility begins and ends. It teaches them to see hostility not as proof of failure but as evidence of the hidden battles others are fighting. And most of all, it reminds them that their gift is not meant to rescue everyone. Jung wrote that each soul must make its own descent into shadow. The empath can be a guide, but they cannot walk the path for another. To try is to lose themselves. To witness without being consumed is the higher calling. Thus the empath, through the very wounds of resentment, begins to embody what Jung described as the wise old man or wise old woman archetype. Not because they know everything, but because they have lived through the paradox of light and shadow and have not turned bitter. They have felt hostility without losing compassion. They have faced projection without losing clarity. And in this way, they become not only a source of comfort but also a living example of resilience. Their light no longer seeks approval. It simply shines because it must. As the empath matures in this path, something subtle begins to change. The resentment of others no longer feels like an unbearable wound but like a signal. It reveals where the world is still asleep and where the shadow still hides. Jung wrote that consciousness is born out of conflict between opposites. For the empath, Every moment of resentment directed at them is such a conflict. It is the clash between what another person pretends to be and what they secretly are. By enduring this tension without collapsing, the empath plays a hidden role in the growth of collective consciousness. They carry light into places where it is resisted most, and by holding that light steady, they make it harder for denial to survive. This role is often misunderstood. Many imagine the empath as someone endlessly gentle, endlessly forgiving, endlessly available. But Jung would remind us that true wholeness is not one-sided. It is not only light but also the strength to protect that light. An empath who survives the hostility of others does so not by becoming weaker but by becoming firmer. They learn to root themselves like a tree, so that resentment may blow like wind around them without uprooting their soul. Their compassion remains, but it is now tempered with clarity. They see more sharply the patterns of projection, the games of the unconscious, and they no longer take these burdens as their own. There is a kind of quiet nobility in this stage of the journey. The empath becomes what Jung might have called a vessel for the self. They no longer shine in order to be loved, nor do they dim themselves to avoid hostility. They shine because the light within them is part of something larger than personal identity. The self, in Jung's sense, is not simply the ego perfected. It is the wholeness of the human being, a union of conscious and unconscious, of light and shadow. To embody the self is to live as an expression of the greater life moving through us. The empath who accepts resentment without internalizing it begins to live in this way. They become less a personality and more a presence. Yet this presence is not detached from pain. The empath still feels deeply. The hostility of others still cuts. But it no longer defines them. They see that resentment is not truly aimed at them but at the light they carry, and beyond that, at the inner work that others resist. This recognition transforms suffering into understanding. What once felt like rejection now feels like evidence of truth. And in that truth, there is peace. Not the peace of avoiding conflict, but the peace of standing firmly in one's essence regardless of conflict. This transformation has ripples beyond the individual. The empath who no longer fears resentment becomes a force of quiet change in their community. Their presence unsettles illusions, but now it also steadies others in their awakening. People begin to notice not only their sensitivity but also their strength. Some will continue to resist, but others will finally feel safe enough to face their own shadows. In this way, the empath becomes a catalyst. Jung believed that the individual who integrates their own psyche contributes to the healing of the collective. The empath who carries their light with both compassion and boundaries embodies this principle in everyday life. There is also a spiritual dimension to this journey. Jung often spoke of the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who brings healing not by avoiding wounds but by transforming them. The resentment that empaths face is one of their great wounds. It isolates them, makes them doubt themselves, and at times drives them into solitude. Yet from this solitude arises depth. They learn to sit with themselves, to draw strength from the silence within, and to discover that their worth is not dependent on the approval of others. This realization is nothing less than an awakening. It is the recognition that the light they carry was never meant to be accepted by all. It was meant to endure regardless. In this endurance, the empath fulfills a deeper archetypal role. They become what Jung would have called a bearer of the transcendent function. This function unites opposites and allows new consciousness to emerge. By holding the tension between love and hostility, between acceptance and rejection, the empath becomes the ground upon which transformation can happen. They may never receive recognition for this role. Many may never understand it. But the soul knows, and in knowing, it continues to shine. In the end, the story of why empaths attract people who secretly resent their light is not a story of failure or misfortune. It is a story of the human condition. Jung showed us that the psyche is always moving toward wholeness, but this movement is rarely smooth. It stirs conflict, resistance, and projection. The empath, by their very nature, becomes part of this process in the lives of others. Their light awakens what is hidden, and the hidden always resists exposure. Resentment, then, is not proof that the empath is wrong. It is proof that the unconscious has been touched. When we see it this way, the pain begins to change shape. The empath does not need to carry the hostility of others as their own wound. They can instead see it as a reflection of the universal struggle between light and shadow. In this recognition lies freedom. The empath learns to remain open without being consumed, compassionate without being naive, present without being dependent on acceptance. They come to embody what Jung described as individuation, the integration of all parts of the self into a deeper wholeness. And in doing so, they remind the world that true strength is not domination, but authenticity. This authenticity is rare. It is what draws others in the first place, even those who cannot fully appreciate it. People are drawn to light instinctively, just as plants turn toward the sun. Even when they resist, even when they resent, some part of them longs for what the empath carries. And while not all will be ready to embrace it, some will. And for those few, the presence of an empath can be life-changing. They may begin to see their own shadow not as an enemy but as a path to growth. They may begin to rediscover the depth of their own heart. And in this way, the light spreads quietly, not by force but by resonance. The empath who understands this no longer lives in despair over the hostility they attract. They see it as part of a larger pattern, a cosmic dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious, between the false and the real. They become, in their own way, a guardian of the inner flame that humanity so often forgets. And though this role is heavy, it is also sacred. Jung wrote that the most important task of the individual is to bring what is unconscious into consciousness. Empaths live this task daily, not only for themselves but for those who cross their path. Even when misunderstood, even when resented, they are fulfilling the deepest work of the soul. There is a quiet beauty in this destiny. To walk through the world carrying light that others resist is not easy, but it is profoundly meaningful. It means that one's life is woven into the great story of awakening that runs through history. It means that even in the face of hostility, one is serving something larger than the self. And in the moments of solitude that follow resentment, when the empath withdraws to heal, they may come to realize that their light does not belong to them alone. It belongs to life itself. And life has entrusted them with the task of keeping it alive. So when an empath asks why they attract people who secretly resent their light, the answer lies not in blame or self-doubt but in the mystery of human growth. Light always calls forth shadow. Compassion always exposes hardness. Truth always unsettles illusion. This is the rhythm of existence, and to walk in it is to walk in the footsteps of every soul who has carried wisdom before. The resentment of others is not the end of the story. It is only a chapter in the larger journey of becoming whole. And for the empath, the final realization is simple and profound. They were never meant to be loved by all. They were meant to be light, and the light must shine.